Caros amigos, estamos de volta com mais Hora Quente esta noite. Antes de apresentar o nosso convidado, quero-vos apresentar a Quimba de Maracujá, o refrigerante oficial da Hora Quente, o sabor dos Açores agora em lata, este sabor autêntico ao maracujá açoriano, agora em qualquer supermercado. Se não tiver no seu supermercado favorito, diga que a J. Muniz pode fornecer Quimba de Maracujá, o sabor dos Açores. Esta noite vai ser um prazer muito grande receber este talentoso luso-americano, realizador, faz de trabalho de vida realização de filmes, já foi alvo, ou recebeu vários prémios pelos seus trabalhos e já há vários anos trabalha num documentário sobre Slatersville. Vamos saber todos esses detalhes, assim como o seu percurso de vida. Senhoras e senhores, é com imenso gosto que apresentamos Christian DeRezendes. Christian, welcome on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you very much. I know it was a little bit of a hike here on a Friday to make
hour,
it to the
yeah.
but we thank you for coming by.
Yeah.
Christian, you are of Portuguese heritage, correct? Mm-hmm. You were born here in the U.S.?
Yes. Woonsocket.
How about your Portuguese roots? What can you tell us about that?
Well, my Portuguese roots, my father was born in São Miguel, about 1943, and his family immigrated over to Newark, New Jersey. My parents met there in New York about 1971 or so. That's that side. My mother's side is from my grandmother. My maternal grandmother was from Trás-os-Montes, a village called Bossuage, and my grandfather was from Coimbra. I'm trying to remember the name. I'm blanking on the name of the actual place around it, but yeah.
No problem.
Telhado. Yeah.
Excellent. How much were you immersed in the Portuguese culture growing up? Being that your parents were from Portugal, but sometimes the fact of trying to assimilate really quick, the children sometimes didn't get much of the Portuguese roots. Did you really feel the Portuguese culture as you were growing up?
I had a kind of a different situation than most people who were Portuguese. I was in North Smithfield, so I was raised there, and my grandfather bought some land there to build a house, couldn't sell it, and so my grandparents moved in and then built around that. So I was in a town where, at least from my memory, there weren't a lot of ethnic Portuguese people, which is contrary to the Portuguese alley story that it comes in Slatersville, but that's later. Yeah, like in that situation, my mom was the director of musical director of Coral Dança Portuguesa in the 80s, and my father was also a guitar player and all of that, and so I was around the culture musically a lot during that time. So I was around it, and areas like this, New Bedford, Fall River, East Providence, I remember that a lot. But as far as North Smithfield goes, not a lot of the Portuguese culture was there for me. It was always on the outside of town.
What were your very first memories with movies?
My very first memories of movies. I just remember, I think, from a young age being more entranced by like MTV, like visuals from that, and also just early like kids movies or movies that really struck me, like E.T., Poltergeist, War Games, Ghostbusters. Those are the ones that I, Cloak and Dagger, the really early ones as a kid. And then as I got older and older, my parents, or my mom, I should say, knew that I really wanted to do it and took it seriously. When at 12, 13, 14, I said I really wanted to do this seriously. And she said, okay, and she supported me wanting to study that and look into it. So at about age 14 and 15, I really delved into it and started studying classic films and things like that, directors, and then it just grew from there. So I would say from about age 7 or 8, I wasn't conscious then really of a career. You don't think about a career at that age, but I remember that's when I really wanted to do what I ended up doing early on. I knew that.
What intrigued you the most about filmmaking at that point? Because like you said, you decided rather young, 14, 15, that's young to decide your career path. A lot of kids at that age think they want to do something, but by the time they actually get out of college or whatnot, they're going in a completely different direction. It wasn't your case.
Yeah, I don't know. I think I was more taken by the visual storytelling, the topics in the films that I was really pulled into, the directors and what they were trying to do. And I took it just very, very seriously. Yeah.
Now, did you study filmmaking locally, or did you go outside of the area?
I studied, I did do some film studies at Rhode Island College. I graduated from there with that degree. But I spent a summer at NYU for a 16 millimeter workshop. My other degrees or experience are more in theater. Because that's what, I started at Dean College. I have an associate's in theater, so that was my focus then. But that's because they didn't really they had more of a communications degree at Dean and not a film degree. They didn't have that at the time. But back then, I could be around the theater crowd, and that was really what I felt more drawn to, I guess, and I really wanted to be more around them while I could figure out the technical on my own, kind of, or in different ways, different classes. So.
What did you dive into most within theater? Did you do acting? Or
Yeah. I acted on stage in a few shows, yeah.
Certainly not something that intrigued you for a career?
It did. I think to be an actor, I acted a couple times since then, and I could do many things, but I had to pick one, and so my first love was doing film. And actually, when I was in the theater performances, the thing that I loved to do is take out my camera and document behind the scenes, and do artsy things with that. So while I was kind of doing this theater thing, this acting thing, which I felt I could be, I always felt I could be strong at it if I focused on it, but I don't think I was really cut out for the whole audition thing. After a while, maybe I would have, grown weak to that. So I felt like I was more in charge and had much more of a love for the actual filmmaking process.
Do you ever miss the stage?
Yeah, I think sometimes I might. Sometimes I wish, I wonder what it would have been like had I continued in that. And it's not too late, so I could go down that path again. Yeah.
There was an interesting detail you brought up about your mother being the choir director, the Coral de Dança Portuguesa, your father being a guitar player. So music was a big part of your growing up. Did you try music? Do you play music?
I can sing. I have the unfortunate truth of when I was a kid, I had things given to me that I really didn't want to focus on because like I said, my whole thing was film.
Yep.
So I was given piano lessons, guitar lessons, even violin lessons, and they just didn't stick with me, regrettably. I didn't have the focus for them. My mom always says that, it was when I finally put a camera in your hands, when you're a teenager, I'm like, okay, that's it. I get it now. I get it. But before that, I was trying to sort of put me into that. And also, somewhere on YouTube, there's this video of me singing with my mother on Rhode Island PBS in 1985.
Really?
Which somebody's going to Google now and try to find it.
Let me write that
and
down.
I never, ever should have said it. I never should have said it.
That's wonderful.
Yeah, but yeah, my parents would have me go on stage at a couple of these functions with the chorale and sing a couple of Azorean folkloric songs. Yeah,
that's great. So you've just been exposed to the arts all of your life, and it was just natural that whatever your career path would be,
but I didn't,
arts would be a part of it.
But I didn't like singing in public at that age. I really did not like that.
Yep.
But I did it, and then in college I did, and other times I have as well. But and that's something else I could do. But again, there are a lot of balls in the air. Which ones do I juggle? So.
What was your very first film? Even as a child, maybe putting something together. What was your very first film? Do you remember?
Well, I think the thing that I have to go to is a documentary I did about my senior high school class called Branches '93. That was done very. I was into these long form documentaries at the time, even at that age. So I had this very primitive type of equipment in 1990. 1994 to 7. I and how I stitched this together is beyond me today, but it was very long and did that thing, and I did a few other projects around that, and then a few years after that, I did Alcides Story, but that was a documentary about my grandmother that was shot in DeRezendes and in Rhode Island and Massachusetts. But the difference with that is at the time, this was the late 90s, I had a really good amount of help from a man named Tom Ohanian, who created the Avid Media Composer. And he taught me how to use the system. And I had also taken a class in Boston for it. And through his help and others, I was able to cut the film on a very high-end digital platform for the day for 20 years ago. And so that's what I think of as like my first professional film, but for me, my first movie is probably the high school one.
You brought up an interesting point regarding technology, and so technology has advanced, especially in television, the audiovisual market. Was it more intriguing doing film back in the day or now? Things are a little easier now as far as how you can do it, but a lot of people always divert to how it used to be, and there was so much more technical aspect behind it. Do you prefer the old school method? That's
an awesome question. There are strengths and weaknesses to both. There's a lot more strengths today because you can just go in and mash anything up and put it together, and you put it in, there it is. I think that with the older way of doing it, before you dove into editing, you really needed to know what you wanted to do, and you had to come up with a plan for it. That's missing today a lot of the times. I mean, sure you get scripts, but now everything is just like really quick 1, 2, 3, and it's out there, and it's exposed to the public before you even before it's even perfected. And back then, especially with the very primitive equipment that I had of over 20 years ago, I'd have to sit there and go, okay, I want to do this and that. How do I switch? Okay, at this point I have to switch to here, and that was very, very labor intensive mentally, but that's how I went about that. So I kind of miss those days in a way, because I don't know, there was just a totally different thought process. But it's much easier to put it together today. It's light years easier than it was then. So,
you mentioned the Alcides Story as being your first professional film. Is that
as close to professional with an 8mm camera as you can get? Yeah.
So tell me a little bit about that. That obviously was a Portuguese-themed film. It was around your grandmother, you said.
Yeah.
So, what was the concept as far? How did you approach telling her story?
In the summer of '95, my family went back to Portugal, and it was my grandmother's first visit back there, I would say, in about 26 years from that point.
Wow.
And before that, it had been another 10, and before that, it had been 29. So she left Portugal when she was 16. She went back when she was 46. She went back again when she was 56, and then back one more time when she was 82, and that was it.
Wow.
And she... this was going to be her last time, really, and so I wanted to just document what was going on, just to document the actual cultural differences and just the feeling of being there, the family interacting, stuff like that. And so I shot all that, and then when I came back, I'm like, okay, I want to put something together, but I realized that I needed the continuity of interviews from my cousins to kind of tell the backstory of what was going on. So I set up things with them. I interviewed a whole bunch of them, used a little bit in the movie just to kind of establish what the world was like over there before they came over. And so, and then you've got the story, and it came together. Also gathering of pictures, and how I did all of that then is crazy too, with the, again, lack of technology. And so the whole story is about how my grandmother came here when she was 16, and she sponsored, her and my grandfather worked for decades to save up enough money to sponsor her brothers and sisters and their families to come over to a life here in the States. And it took a long time. And she came here in 1930. She and my grandfather were married in 41. She got her American citizenship in 1954, and then it wasn't until 66 that the first families came.
So quite a while, to work towards getting the family here. But there was patience back then. People waited.
Well, they had to. They didn't have a choice. They didn't have a choice.
Now, Christian, since then you've made many films. How many films have your signature up until this point?
I don't know. I think I've directed over 20 pieces, but only three have been feature length. There have been a lot of short pieces, short documentaries on a wide range of stuff. I did one of the short pieces I did was something called Fueling Fierce, the Shannon Heil story, which was about a young lady who died in a car accident about 6 years ago now, and how her father started a Pay It Forward campaign in her honor. That's gotten over 70,000 hits online. It's a very incredible story and inspiring one. And so that's one. There's another feature documentary I did called Raising Maddie Christian that came out about 5 years ago, which was about a young man from Canton, Massachusetts, who was born without full limbs.
Okay.
And it's a little shocking when you see it at first, but it's an inspiring story. It's a very touching story, and that's really moved a lot of people. And so those are some examples of that. And if I go back 12 years ago, there was a film I did called 41, which is about the youngest victim of the Station nightclub fire, Nicholas O'Neill. I co-directed that with his brother, also named Christian. And that really moved a lot of people as well. So the topics that I take on in a lot of my films have, LGBTQ subject matter, drug addiction is in there, alcoholism is in there, the tragedy of the fire is in there. And also, because I do a lot of documentary work in very, very sad stories in a way, the short dramatic pieces that I do are usually, well, I said dramatic, but the short narrative pieces I do are usually are comedic. I directed a short piece called Cat Scratch, which is a lot of fun, and then another one called It Might Be Me, and then another one called Memories for Sale, which was based on a one-act play up in by the Image Theater up in Lowell, Mass. So the range is across the board, and I really try and make it as eclectic as possible.
All of your films are either documentaries or fictional narratives, right?
Yeah, they're mostly documentaries. It's kind of like the moment I tried to get away from documentaries, it's like the Godfather line. It's like they pull me back in, kind of a thing. I remember years ago I said, okay, that's it, no more docs for a while, and then that immediately led to 41. Which was a doc. So, I guess that's what I'm meant to do.
So documentaries and generally emotional stories. Why? Why particularly? What draws you to that type of story more?
I think just structurally, a documentary is more interesting to me to put together. I was shooting an interview once in North Carolina, and with a 98-year-old lady who's 101 now.
Wow.
And her mom was trying to explain to her what I did. I'm sorry, not her mom. Her daughter. Her daughter. Yeah, they last long down there. No, her daughter was trying to explain to her what I did, and she said, he's a puzzle maker. And that kind of fit beautifully. And that's really the essence of how I put together documentaries. And for me, that's the challenge in finding that narrative and filming what happens and sculpting it into something that's compelling and all of this. And so that, to me, it takes a lot more stamina, brain power, creativity, whatever it is that, you really find those storytelling beats in the editing room. And that is the real joy of me, of doing that in documentary. In narrative, it's different because it's scripted, and you can discover a lot of things in the editing room still, but it's all there. It's like you don't, maybe have to think as much or whatever the case may be. So there's strengths and there are pros and cons to each. It just depends on what you love doing more.
How do you go about picking the topic that you're going to do a film on?
A lot of the times, the things I've been asked to direct sort of come to me. you know, I always think of Raising Matty Christian. I was brought that project by a man named Paul Plotkin, and he was hired to transfer old videos to DVD by the family after Matty had passed away. And he's like, I got to show you about this project. Let me put this on for you so you can see what I've been looking at. And the first thing I saw was a shot of this kid running on the beach, okay? Knees, just to the knees, just to the elbow. Actually, one leg went to the ankle. And he was also born without a tongue. And he's just running on the beach, and I was just like, how is that kid doing that? And then I knew right in that moment, I have to figure out how he's doing that, and I also knew I needed to make the movie. And it's like some things you just feel like you have to do. And but of course that wasn't up to me, and gratefully and thankfully his parents agreed and asked me to do it. So there are very different reasons for why, you know, subjects come along, and, you know, in the case of Fueling Fierce, I certainly worked with Brian Heil, Shannon's father, and so I knew much of the story through that. And in the case of 41, you know, that was a very odd story. It was an odd search for inspiration in light of like a horrendous tragedy. So, and it also combines some paranormal elements. So sometimes it's just a mixture of things that present themselves, or it's like, oh my God, like that's really interesting, and I need to put this together into a narrative. So.
Have you ever released a documentary, watched it, things happened after that, and you've wanted to go back in and retell the story?
Yeah, to a degree. 41 had one of those. The whole thing about the story with 41 is that the short version is Nick O'Neill was obsessed with the number 41 before he passed away, and this is well documented, and there are a lot of connections with the number that happened after his death that are just uncanny. And there was one that was huge for me personally that happened I learned about 3 years after the movie came out. And I said, oh my God, if I just had that piece of information, I would have put it into the film, which, you know, we could still do. Who knows?
What inspires you, Christian?
In general?
In general.
When I get up in the morning? What I have for breakfast? I mean, can you be specific?
I like to be vague with these type of questions.
What inspires me? I think when it comes to making films, it really needs to be a story that sticks and an idea that sticks. I've dealt with so many ideas through the years, both narrative and documentary. I've had to abandon projects because they just weren't coming together, or they just weren't interesting, creative differences, whatever. But there are certain things that just really stick, and usually that has to do with the whole vision of the piece. You know, you look up and you see a huge mural on a wall, and you're like, okay, and then that happens there, and that happens there. And that, to me, is probably one of the more interesting reasons for making any project. But if it takes a long time, like Slatersville has taken a long time, then I really need to make sure that that inspiration is solid and in place, and I have a very strong vision for it.
Who are some of your favorite filmmakers?
Oh God, well, Martin Scorsese. I mean, we're just talking about him this morning with some friends.
The whole Marvel controversy.
Oh yeah, that whole thing. Which I completely sympathize with his comments on as a filmmaker, but leaving that alone before somebody else runs in the studio and tries to beat me up.
I think you're okay here. The doors are locked.
Yeah, okay, good. So Scorsese, Peter Bogdanovich's work. Some of my favorite films are Wings of Desire by Wim Wenders, Last Picture Show by Peter Bogdanovich, Avalon by Barry Levinson. Once Upon a Time in America by Sergio Leone. You can hear, I've thought of this, obviously. My favorite Scorsese movie is actually probably a three-way tie between Goodfellas, Age of Innocence, and Last Temptation of Christ. And I know that's kind of an odd mixture, but Taxi Driver's in there. Moonstruck by Norman Jewison. Hoosiers by David Anspaugh. Fellini's works, certain works by Spielberg. I mean, the list. Coppola, where would I be without seeing what Coppola did with Apocalypse Now and so many other things? And, so, yeah.
Are you able to watch movies the same way today that you did maybe 30 years ago?
Oh, hell no. No, I'm incredibly, it's hard for me sometimes. I can't, I'm like, okay, there's a whole bunch of movies I want to see, and I can't just sit down and go, okay, I'm going to relax, right? And I'm really just going to get into it. Now, sometimes I can, you know, particularly if it's a genre that I know that I will never direct in my lifetime a comic book movie. I just know it's not my thing. But if it's a movie that is along the lines of something that, you know, Richard Linklater might do, or any of the independent directors, and like, yeah, I really hone in on that and
analyze it in a completely different form than a normal movie watcher, right?
Yeah, editing and pacing for me, and yeah, I do get critical, but I don't find that to be a burden at all, because I love doing it, you know. But what my abilities as a filmmaker allow me to do in watching movies is to really hone in on why I feel a film does or does not work. And that's something that I'm happy about.
When you, before I get to that point, let me talk a little bit about your accolades. You've acquired quite a few throughout your career. What was your very first award, and for what film?
My first award was for a movie called Branches 93, the high school documentary. I got an honorable mention at something called Intercom, which was supported by the Chicago International Film Festival at the time. Now, I was 21, but I have to laugh at this award now, because that documentary ran on 2 SVHS tapes and ran 3 hours long. And it took me forever to do it, just stitching together things with the really rustic technology we had at the time. I literally think a bunch of people sat there and went, yeah, he's crazy, let's give this to him. And sometimes you just get awards and grants just because of that. Like, he's crazy, either give it to him because we have to tell him he's crazy, or just make him go away. And I think that's actually how I've gotten a few of these.
I tend not to believe that, but if that makes you happy, Christian, then by all means. Very good. Let's take a break. We'll be back to talk about your current project, a project that's been going on for the past 7 years, correct?
More than that.
More than that. So we'll talk about it in a minute. Senhoras e senhores, estamos esta noite com Christian DeRezendes, realizador que já tem vários filmes ao longo da sua carreira. Agora está a trabalhar num chamado Slatersville. Já a seguir vamos saber todos os pormenores. Fique connosco, mais Hora Quente já a seguir.